Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to build the most prosperous place in the world. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs and to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. In Season 8, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. In this episode, we're joined by Stephen Poloz. He's a former governor of the Bank of Canada and a widely recognized economist with nearly 40 years of experience in financial markets, forecasting, and economic policy, including 35 years in the public sector. Stephen sits down with Scott to discuss how to navigate uncertainty.
I am very excited to have Stephen Poloz, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. I know myself and so many other Canadians enjoyed hearing from you during the pandemic. And when I think of the early days of COVID-19, your face will forever be top of mind. And I think many Canadians will have many memories of you on television from those early days of the pandemic. And thank you so much to your service for Canada, both during your time as governor of the Bank of Canada, but also throughout your close to 40 years of public service in Canada.
Well, you're welcome. It's been quite a ride, and I've always felt proud of what it was I was doing. It always felt very meaningful, and never more so than during that crisis.
You're the author of The Age of Uncertainty, which is a fantastic book. I'm looking at it right now, and I've read it earlier this year and just reread it again in advance of this interview. Stephen, what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, well, it's, a lot of people say that there are similarities between today and the 1970s. And then they're quick to say, but there are really big differences too. A lot of things happened in the 1970s that caused economics almost to fall apart. And John Kenneth Galbraith wrote The Age of Uncertainty to explain to people why economics was failing to explain what was going on around them at that time. And while I was a grad student in the late 70s, economics was being rewritten because economics had kind of broken down. Macroeconomic frameworks just didn't work in the 70s. I came to this thinking that maybe I could help companies think longer term. I wanted to contribute to the discussion of short-termism, in the way companies behave. And, if you want to tell a company they shouldn't be practicing short-termism, you really should offer an alternative, which is something that helps frame their longer-term thinking. And this is what makes you think about these historical episodes and whether the 70s are relevant to today. And I quickly discovered that there aren't many things that are constant. The things that economists usually think of as constants, like population growth or technology and those kinds of things, actually today are very much not constant. And in fact, the most important one being demographics changing dramatically. And so I quickly realized that if I was going to help anybody think about the long term, I had to understand the things that were in motion. And so that kind of brought me to these 5 tectonic forces that are in motion and try to help people understand how they would affect the business environment. So to be honest, I started in a different place where I ended up. I didn't realize at the beginning that there was an actual narrative, a thread that would connect these things together when I first set out.
As governor of the Bank of Canada, one of the things that you had to deal with is all of these massive tectonic changes to the world and to Canada's economy. Can you talk a little bit about some of those principal forces that are creating this age of uncertainty?
Yeah, so I called my little book The Next Age of Uncertainty in deference to Galbraith's big book on The Age of Uncertainty, sort of riding on his coattails, if you like. But many of the forces that are at play are working opposite to the way they were back when Galbraith was writing. And demographic being the most important one. In the 1970s, people like me were just entering the workforce. And there was this gigantic increase in the global workforce because of the post-war baby boom, approximately 20 years after World War II, and then lasting for about 20 years, that bulge. And we're only now, 50 years later, getting the retirement wave of that people. So if you think about the past 50 years as, on average, that's normal, you'd be wrong. The past 50 years were historically very abnormal. And now that the 50 years of the baby boom is over, now we're going back to something what's more the much longer term notion of normal, with slower economic growth, lower real interest rates, those kinds of features that we had like before World War II. But that's just the one force. Technological progress is something we counter every day, but it's my second tectonic force. It has only happened 3 times in human history where we've had major industrial revolutions, the steam engine, electricity, and then the computer chip. And now we're having the fourth, which is the digitization of everything. And so those industrial revolutions give unique stresses to the global economy. So we're entering one of those periods now. The third one is rising income inequality, which always comes along with industrial revolutions. As you can imagine, you bring in a new technology, there's a bunch of people that get their jobs destroyed and so on, and they end up in the bottom of the heap. And who makes out is the people that introduce the technology. So you get this widening of income disparities. We've had a big widening of income disparities in the wake of the computer chip revolution, and that's going to happen again now under the digitization revolution. And so that's a really important stressor for the world. That gives rise to political polarization, populism, and a lot of extra stress. Hard for governments to do their jobs. And so it adds volatility to the mix. And the fourth tectonic force is the easiest. That's rising debt. Everybody knows about rising debt. But just to remind you that governments today are as indebted as they were right after World War II. So there's another kind of similarity to that period in history. Difference being that back then we had a baby boom that would eventually pay for it. And this time we're not going to have a baby boom to help us pay for it. And the fifth tectonic force is climate change, or more specifically, the forced transition to net zero by 2050. That is a complex overlay that goes on top of all of these other things, which will add a lot more uncertainty to how business is going to unfold in that period. Right now, people are saying we're going to be net zero by 2050, but no one really knows the path we will take to get there, and certainly what that might mean for an individual company or an individual. So all those things together, I think everybody could talk about the one at a time, but what intrigued me was that they're all moving a lot right now. And when you feed nonlinear forces into a mathematical framework, what happens is mathematicians have a theory around this. It's called the mathematics of chaos. And because the things interact with each other and produce literally chaos, if you like, completely inexplicable outcomes based on your knowledge of the underlying system. So that just suggests to me we're headed for a very, very volatile period. Things are not going to quieten down once the pandemic is behind us.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this interview last night. My in-laws just arrived, and they're in their early 60s, recently retired, and have some anxiety around the market conditions as we tape in October 2022, like many Canadians. And I was thinking of your book, and the comment I said to them is the only prediction one can make is that there's going to be more uncertainty. We don't know. There's 1,000 different directions way things can go. And I think that mantra, which is a thesis, kind of one of the core theses of your book, is an important one to think about, and how you reference the work of Nassim Taleb and Black Swan, but also Anti-Fragile. And I think one of the things that we try to think about at Venture for Canada is how can we foster young people or institutions to not just be resilient, but actually be anti-fragile in the face of uncertainty. So in essence, that a resilient thing, if you throw it on the ground, it doesn't break. An anti-fragile thing, if you throw it on the ground, it actually becomes stronger. So a question that I have for you, Steve, is as you give advice to entrepreneurs and you think about people running businesses across the country, how can they foster anti-fragile institutions and businesses that actually thrive in this increasingly uncertain environment?
From an individual point of view, I think it's a world in which the idea that adaptability or flexibility is always worth having. I've always worked that way in my head. Every time you make a decision, you ask yourself, are you cutting off future optionality by making a decision, or are you creating more optionality for your future? And so usually I try to make sure that I wasn't cutting off avenues for my future whenever I made a decision. If I made the wrong decision, it would. And so that kind of thinking would be, doubly important in the world I'm describing. And so, if you have this sort of as an individual, you have a continuous learning kind of lifestyle, that's going to pay off really well in a much more volatile world than it did. In the past, it just meant you had more interesting opportunities, but in the future, it might be more like survival. So it's more anti-fragile to be continuously learning so that you're prepared for a shift to a new path because your job is no longer needed or something like that because of technology. Also, financial conservatism. I mean, I think my generation, and I am like your in-laws. I'm in my mid 60s. I think my generation has not been financially conservative. And it could be partly because interest rates in general have been falling and then low for much of that time. But also the availability of credit became, easier, giving almost like a self-serve buffet of credit for young people today. And, banks are accommodating, they put it there and off you go. Well, I think as we go into a more volatile world, people won't buy the biggest house that the bank will let them buy. They'll hold dry powder. They'll carry a higher level of savings. When there's two breadwinners in the house, that's great, and they've got flexibility. Presumably, if the two people are in exactly the same firm, that's not risk mitigating. If they're in two different firms, that would be risk mitigating. You see what I'm saying? There's a little bit of risk management that can go into everyday living. And so I think we'll see people adapt to this. They will change their behavior around things like mortgages, or whether they rent right away, or buy right away, or rent for longer, that kind of thing. We'll see more multi-generational living, just because it pools the resources and keeps everybody safer from risk. And businesses, well, there's lots of things that businesses I think will do.
It's interesting, in some ways, a little bit of a reversion to the past. I think of your book where you talk about your personal story and at various points in your childhood, how you lived with your grandparents and your parents in one multi-generational family. And yeah, how that can be like a very cost-effective approach. And it's interesting in our work at Venture for Canada, where we work with many people who are kind of between the ages of 22 and 30. We see that the rise of multi-generational living today way more than people 10, 20 years ago. So in some ways, a little bit of a reversion to the past.
That's right. And you can hope, if you like, that unlike my case, I can tell you when I lived in a 3-generation house with my grandparents and my parents, it was not Downton Abbey. Just so you know. It was a quite small, what they call a wartime house that was built by the government for returning veterans from World War II to house their baby boom. It was to encourage people to have a house and have more kids. And so it was not a nice big place like on Downton Abbey, but in any case, it was a congenial place, and the reason it happened was because my parents were in financial trouble. And so, And so in many ways, it happens now. If the stresses and the volatility affect the kids, then, you see more of this multi-generational living. And I think it could be something that people will opt for. Think of it not as a financial stress situation, but later in life, where more caregiving is needed for the older generation. Then how convenient is that? If the house can accommodate the number of people, then it's quite handy to be there for that extra, lend that extra hand, when it's needed. And so there may be, not a financial reason, but just a practicality reason, or, just because people care, and so all these things, there are many other things I think that individuals may do, but I think the more interesting stuff is what will companies do in this more volatile world. They're going to have to really work hard to prosper in a high volatility world. But at least companies are more likely to think of risk in the way it should, which is that it's two-sided. Most people, when you hear the word risk, that's negative. They just think, oh, that's bad. But in fact, risk comes with two sides. So there's usually at least as much good luck as there is bad luck because of risk. And so as a company, you need to be ready to capitalize on the good luck. It's not the same as just defending against bad luck. And for individuals too, and that's what I meant by if you invest in skills, if you're always doing continuous learning as a part of your life, what I like to do is I like to read fiction. I read lots of fiction, but I try to alternate between a fiction and a nonfiction book. It's just kind of been a habit probably for most of my life. And that doesn't mean I'm learning new skills all the time, but I am always learning some new stuff. And anyway, that idea could really become something that generates a premium in your life because it builds adaptability or flexibility into your thinking, and it builds your openness to do new things if something bad happens to you.
And the ability to be creative in many ways, especially with more, in essence, the more you know, the more you can sometimes connect disparate dots that others might not necessarily see. Shifting a little bit to your personal life, and by the way, one of the things I loved about this book is you've been a central banker, you were head of the Bank of Canada, and many other folks in similar situations to you write books that are not necessarily the most accessible to the general public. And I think it's a testament to your communication style, both today as well as when you were in the governor of the Bank of Canada, that you're very effective at translating quite very complicated concepts into language that everyday Canadians can easily understand. So I just wanted to share that compliment around your book, because I think that this is a book, does not require one to have a PhD in economics to read. And I think that is one of the things that makes this book so valuable for all Canadians.
Well, thank you. I wanted it to be, when I set out, I wanted it to be relevant around the boardroom table, right? Because I was really aiming to help companies think about longer term issues in planning their businesses. But as I worked on it, I realized, many of the things that are going to happen in this new world, this next stage of uncertainty, apply just as much to individuals. And so therefore, I worked hard to make sure it was accessible for the conversation around the kitchen table too. So that was one of the objectives, and I'm glad to hear you say that it turned out that way.
In terms of your lived experience as a policymaker, and I think back to that March 2020 period, there are probably few moments in modern Canadian history where there was so much uncertainty. I remember even reading in the news, a lot of the discussion was around, oh, is there going to be a lot of deflation? There was no sense, are we headed for the Great Depression? There was a lot of different potentials of what could have happened. And when you think back to those the period of kind of late February 2020 through March 2020, and that unprecedented period of uncertainty, at least in my lifetime, not necessarily in the context of human history though, what did you learn as a policymaker in terms of how to navigate uncertain situations?
Well, you've positioned it very well. It was a very scary moment. That's mainly the emotion that comes back to me when I think back on it. But there was also this sense of, if you've been a firefighter all your career, and mostly what you've done is give first aid classes and help people install smoke detectors and polish the fire truck. And then suddenly there's a big 3 alarm fire. This is what you're trained to do, right? This is why the firehouse exists. It's not for handing out smoke detectors, that's great. Fire prevention is really good. And you might say if you did a really great job with fire prevention, you wouldn't need firefighters, but of course we know we would. So central banks were made for what happened. And usually people think of the central bank as a place that issues banknotes and moves interest rates once in a while. Nobody understands why they're going up or going down really, because it's pretty complicated stuff. Highly esoteric, and you can explain it 10 different ways, and they could all be complicated ways, and so, but along comes an actual crisis, and the best thing to think of is that the central bank is the firefighter. And so what you do is you've got these tools which amount to liquidity. And it is just like having a fire hose. You make that liquidity available. I think of the economy, the great big hole opened up in the economy. We shut it down. We literally shut it down. I mean, 20% of it was shut down. We shut down the whole thing, and then necessity parts stayed open. GDP shrank by 20%, virtually overnight. And so the idea from the central bank's point of view is fill the hole up with liquidity, and that'll allow everybody to row their boats across that hole. And once we get to the other side, then you can get out of your boat, and then it's okay. You can drain the liquidity out of the hole, right? Which is the mopping up stage. And what I learned, I think, I mean, at the time, my memories of the 2008 crisis were still reasonably fresh. I wasn't a central banker, but I was in the financial system. I was lending money from Export Development Canada, filling the gaps left behind by the banks. So I was on that front line then, and I remember watching it, what was going on the policy side. And I think if we look back then, eventually all the tools got used, but it took like a long time to develop a new tool, get approval for a new tool, put the new tool in place. Then a new crack opened up. Oh, well, you need another tool. So the crisis kind of festered longer. This time, having been through all that and having great team beside me, Carolyn Wilkins was the senior deputy governor, had been through the 2008 crisis, developing all these liquidity tools back when Mark Carney was the governor. So she was perfect to be in the right place at the right time. And we agreed that we would just deploy everything all at once right away. And to me, that worked like a charm. I mean, I think it's almost like you're using overwhelming force rather than gradualism. Well, maybe it's not as bad as it looks. Let's just do this. Well, and then you find out it is as bad as it looks. You have to do something else. And then the crisis can kind of get some momentum going, and it's hard to stop it. But if you give it everything at once, it's just overwhelmed. And I remember a reporter asking me, don't you think you're overdoing it a little? Because I think they thought it wasn't as bad as I was describing. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, a firefighter hardly ever gets criticized for using too much water, right? They get the fire out and then you mop up the water. That's how it works. And so I thought we carried that attitude through, and I think it worked very well for us. So that was an important, if not, I always thought it might be that way, but now we learned, that it works that way. The second thing that I thought was new to me was I was skeptical that governments, and I don't mean ours or just ours, I mean all governments, would have trouble bringing their tools to bear. And we knew they had to be the most important tool. Fiscal policy had all the room to maneuver. Central banks didn't have much leverage in this situation, but they just had to calm everything down. who knew that fiscal policy would be so good that it would actually fill up the whole gap and everybody would be able to go on like before? I mean, of course, people still got hurt. Don't get me wrong, but my goodness, as a macroeconomic shock, we've never had anything that big or that sudden. And we've never had a fiscal policy so good, so well designed to get the job done, especially in Canada, because the tools were made elastic. They were only as big as was needed to respond to the underlying problem. So when they said there's 30 billion or 40 billion available, people accused them of spending too much money. They didn't spend the money. They just put it on the shelf so people could ask for it, you know? And so I got to say, that was a big learning for me, that when the crisis comes, the government's going to look really slow and not able to decide and always arguing. You know, the US, Congress, and Senate, and could we have a package? No. Or maybe a small package, big package. Here in Canada it was easier, but even so, I didn't expect governments anywhere in the world to come together as cleanly as they did and get the job done. So it just shows you well, Ian Bremmer's new book, The Power of Crisis, is essentially that. It's like when a crisis happens, my goodness, people really move the yardsticks. And it makes me think, if you think about Ian's book together with my book, mine saying, well, there's going to be all this volatility and politics is going to be a struggle, you know, to deal with it. And the suggestion is that if it takes a crisis to make a decision, we're just going to go from crisis to crisis to crisis. And yes, decisions will happen, but only in those crises. And the rest of the time, you know, politics will just be arguing with each other. Polarized politics will just, you know, get us nowhere. And so that's a recipe for volatility forever, right? Because the tools will never calm it down.
It reminds me of the famous quote from Rahm Emanuel when he was the former chief of staff to President Obama, mayor of Chicago, long time civil servant in the U.S. And he once said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." And I think for many, and he's by far, there are many other people in the history of the world who has said a similar quote. But I think it's an important one to think about, is just the extent to which in moments of human history where everything is up in the air, that's often when there are by far the most changes. And one thinks back to the period of World War II and shortly after as well. So many of the international institutions that exist today, so much of our world order was really created out of the ashes of a period of incredible uncertainty. And while there have been changes, those institutions largely are still intact today. That's just one example, but it's to say, I think it's a really interesting to think of, both in terms of government and policy, but also even in the extent of business as well. If you're running a business that goes through a crisis, there's likely to be way more changes during that period of crisis than in potentially a period of prosperity.
And when there's a crisis, what do people really need? I mean, they're in the fog of war. They have no idea what's happening to them. What they need is a clear voice that says, okay, we understand this. We have the tools. We're taking care of it. And I don't care if it takes this much, you know, like when they said, well, why do you need such a big facility? You know, why do you need to do that much in order to calm things down? The answer is because I'm going to use as much water as I want to get the fire out. I am not going to measure my water. You know, on Star Trek, Jean-Luc Picard never gets in an argument with Worf about how many photon torpedoes we should use. Okay, there is never a debate about whether we should use 6 or 10 or only one. Never. It's like load photon torpedoes, launch photon torpedoes, and then the job is done. And it was like that. That's exactly what was in my mind. I'm not kidding. That's exactly what was in my mind as we were in those meetings and deciding, you know, what should we do? How big should it be? How should we tackle this? I said, throw everything at it and everything will be fine. And that voice of reason, I think, is important to people in a crisis, right? It causes them to say, okay, well, we're going to get through this somehow. And there you go. So we did.
That reassurance is critical to calming people in a period where they have no idea how things are going to go. And by the way, I do love all of your Star Trek references in the book. There are many, and I can tell you are a big fan of Star Trek. One book I recommend listeners to read, which I read 4 or 5 months after March 2020, sometime in summer 2020, is John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash, which I imagine, yeah, you have read, Steve, and it's an excellent book to see, okay, what happens when there's a big crisis and there is no action at the beginning. And you end up having a protracted economic depression for many years. And I didn't know that much about, I knew about the Great Depression at a high level, more about its political consequences. But that book is a fascinating one to read to understand what caused the Great Depression, of which, of course, there are many factors, but one of which was not using virtually any water at the beginning to stem the crisis. And then you have a much bigger issue. So to your point, I think when we're taping this in October 2022, 2.5 years later, I think a lot of people, to some extent, have forgotten what would have been the consequences of not acting. And it's an important one to look at history and to see what can happen if you don't use enough water.
Well, absolutely right. Even in 2008, we didn't use enough water. We dribbled it out. We were like, oh, well, let's try this, let's try that, then let's try this now. And in 2014, we were still not fully recovered from the consequences of the global financial crisis. It was not really until about 2015 where we got about there. And so that's a long time. And I think Galbraith's point was perfectly right, but I mean, we haven't really learned that lesson that well. I mean, and here we're much longer afterwards in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, still not realizing, you should just use your force, get it done. Or look at Japan, they never cleaned up their banks back in 1989, 1990. And so, we got the lost decade, and so those lessons are learned hard because there's political costs to moving quickly and being decisive. Sometimes it doesn't go so well. I think we should be proud that this turned out pretty well. You're right, though. People have completely forgotten. They're talking about the inflation risk, and inflation has gotten out of hand, and so on. And no one prefaces those comments with, "Oh, by the way, thanks for averting the Second Great Depression," which is what everybody was worried about. It's what many economists said. This would be the worst recession, at least the worst recession since the Great Depression. And all the deflation was there. We had all the ingredients of a depression. So we averted that. And believe me, it's much easier to deal with an inflation problem than it is to rectify a depression. History certainly proves that.
Agreed. And one only needs to study the Great Depression and some other economic challenges, including the depression of the Victorian era, which is one piece you talk a little bit in your book. As an aside, if our listeners want to learn about another inspiring Canadian, John Kenneth Galbraith, who is referenced a lot in Steve's book, is a fascinating person to learn more about. But that's a footnote as a background. He did a lot of things from a very humble background in St. Thomas, Ontario, and it's interesting. Most Canadians, I feel like, are not that aware of John Kenneth Galbraith, and many don't even know that he is Canadian. So, as a Canadian, I feel like I need to highlight that.
And he basically wrote what I call popular economics, right? He wrote economics for regular folks to just read and understand the economy better. And so as an academic, he was a little bit dismissed, right? Because he was not serious, doing math and all the rocket science type of economics. He was more like an explainer. And, I guess that's a little bit how I see myself. I kind of explain things to people, but now, Galbraith was incredibly successful. And I remember he managed the price controls, right, in the United States. I mean, he was a Harvard economist and all that stuff. But anyway, as the academics that teach you in university, they'll say, "Oh, Galbraith, well, he's sort of a popular economist, not a serious one." But I don't agree, obviously. He's a very deep thinker.
Yeah, and made a huge impact in terms of actually influencing policy, which I think is one of the most important measures. Another piece in the book where you reference your personal life and how it impacted your relationship with uncertainty is your discussion around a near-death experience that you had in 2004. For our listeners, can you speak a little bit about this experience and how it altered your relationship with uncertainty?
Well, okay. Yeah, I was on the golf course with a good friend, and I felt a little unusual. I thought maybe it was just because it was a hot day, but at a certain point, my head started to swim, and I actually sat down in the middle of the fairway at the golf course, and then I sort of settled down, and then I stood up. My friend was on the other side of the golf course or the fairway, and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And that was the last thing I remember. I was gone. And by the time he got to me, I had no heartbeat and no breath sounds, and a flatline basically. And anyway, I came to in a couple of minutes, which was great because he did CPR. And so this was a major turning point, as I think it would be for almost anybody. As it turned out, I had a faulty valve in my heart, and they replaced it with a steel one. And I'd experienced sudden death, and about 50% of the time you come out of it. And when someone gives you CPR, it boosts your chances. So I was very lucky that my friend Glenn was there that day, and he knew what he was doing. So I never forget Glenn's birthday. Let's just say that. So, but all that to say, after that, you kind of have this different look on life, which is like, it's almost like you're invincible, but also more to the point, things that, you kind of didn't value before, or you thought was, less important than work, suddenly became more important. And you realize you've reached a fork in the road, and you behave differently from then on. And so this concept of a fork in the road plays quite a role in my book, as you know. So think about a decision you might have made 10 years ago or 20 years ago, like, oh, which university to go to, or whether to go, or whether to get married or not, or something like that. And think about if you'd made the opposite decision, and then 20 years later, where would you be? It's hard to imagine those counterfactuals, but the point is that uncertainty accumulates through time, because you make a decision and it causes a fork in the road. And so you spin up, say, 2 years or 5 years, there could be a really big gap between where you are and where you would have been if you'd made the opposite decision. And that is a measure of how time compounds uncertainty, because you couldn't have guessed those things the day you made that decision. You might have imagined they were possible, but you didn't guess them. And so this is an important understanding. Like when economists forecast like for a year ahead, there's a certain amount of uncertainty around that, of course. If they were 2 years ahead, the uncertainty is probably 4 times as big. And 5 years, like a business needs in order to run a business, it's massive amount of uncertainty around that forecast. So it's almost nonsense to focus on the core, the central scenario that the economist offers you as a guide to your business, because the range of possibilities for that business is so wide. It just makes no sense to spend all your money figuring out how to stay on that track. So this is why I think a lot of businesses fail. They aren't prepared for those diverse outcomes. And people, I mean, I of course, now I look back on it and think that was an important fork in the road. I never once did I tell my kids they had to make their bed after that. I just thought, who really cares whether my kids make their bed or not? It's like, it doesn't matter. So if they want to get into a bed that's all rumpled at night, that's okay. Anyway, that's just a trivial little example, but it's what something like that does to you. It causes you to reweigh the things you do and the things you spend your time and energy on. And what you do is you spend more time with friends and with family, because suddenly seems so incredibly valuable, because you're 48 years old and it could have been all gone. So, otherwise, when I was in my 40s, I don't know if the listeners are like that. If I was awake, I was basically working.
I think that's such an important message for folks to hear. And by the way, it was also what I needed to hear today. I've been a little hard on myself because I recently, we sent out, I'm getting married next year, and I sent out a wedding save the dates, and there was a little typo. And I was being really hard on myself. And I was like, oh my God, how did I not see that typo? And then I was thinking about your remarks, and I was like, does it really matter? I was like, who cares? It's to save the date. What matters if there's a typo? I share that the date was right. There was just a I won't go into the specific details. So there was a relatively small little detail that was wrong, and but the actual date was correct. And one of the things I was thinking about is, and I share that just because I think that so many other listeners might think about something you might be hard on yourself. That's some relatively trivial thing that you won't remember 10 or 20 years, later. And I think we all sometimes fixate sometimes on these things that aren't that valuable. So thank you for sharing that experience, Steve. And it's also a testament to the fact that you had this more relaxed approach to life, and you also still had this significant level of professional success. It's not like, you had this experience and then you just coasted for the next, 2 decades. That you're able to balance that mixture of, family and building relationships with people while still having a very rewarding and successful career.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think when we're in our career, we think we won't maximize our success without really working all the time. I think it's competitive. It is. And so it's quite natural. And yet what I've discovered is that, in fact, to be fresh and able to do innovative things and to participate in real time, I need to be better rested, and I need to be more widely read, and I need to be, a little less focused on that mechanics, And so I think it actually served me well to be able to sit back, keep my perspective. And indeed, one of the things it does promote in you is to actually participate in teamwork. Teamwork is not teamwork if the boss is doing it all too, Teamwork means the boss has to have the trust to say, I know my team's taking care of that. And then when the team is taking care of that, and they know that you trust them, they will lay down in front of a train for you to get the job done. And if that works both ways, then everybody's great, and the boss can actually relax and think and be ready for the big moment when it comes. And I think that kind of thinking doesn't enter a lot in people's way of imagining a career and how they maximize it.
Yeah, I think that is excellent advice for managers and leaders to think about. And working more or working harder is often not the right path. Delegating and trusting one's team and giving them the authority to make decisions is often the best path to make. One thing that comes to mind, and this is a question that I have around managing a central bank. And one of the things is, at least my image of people who work in central banks, is that there are a lot of people who are very smart, who have often been the smartest people in the room, in their various rooms, like of life in school, and that also very ambitious and very intellectually curious. And I can imagine it is both an incredibly exciting place to work, but it also can be, my hypothesis is, a somewhat complicated place to be the chief executive officer of. So I might be completely off, Steve, but I'd love to know, like, what if you were to give advice to like a new governor of a central bank? It doesn't have to be just Canada, it could be any other country, on how to like run the institution as like the CEO, like on a more managerial level. What advice would you give that person?
Well, first of all, you've described it very well. At the top of, or not even at the top, throughout the central bank, it's almost every central bank I've been anywhere near is based on a culture of excellence, and excellence in the extreme, and paying attention to details. If the public ever knew how much work goes into something that seems so tiny, they might be flabbergasted. I think they would be. They might actually think they're not getting their money's worth, and yet no detail is unimportant in work that is this important. Every day you feel that sense of responsibility, which is glorious. You feel like this matters so much. Aren't we privileged to be part of it? So you have that attitude around the table, and everybody wants to give their very, very best, and they're really, really good at it. And so how do you manage that? Well, to be honest, I think I'm going to tell you one more Star Trek thing. I mean, if you watch the Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I know you have, and watch Jean-Luc Picard and how he is modeled as a leader, you will see a lot of great traits there. And I think he's been very cleverly written. He's obviously not perfect. He's a little bit unemotional in the early seasons. He's a bit of a mechanic. And yet, what you see is people absolutely love him and would do anything for him, and he's always consulting them. There's only 9 seconds left. The black hole is going to swallow the Alpha Quadrant, in 9 seconds. And he asks Geordi, options, and Geordi, of course, is working just as hard, and he's got an idea. And Picard doesn't debate it. He just says, make it so. And the problem is solved, and so you see those incredible examples of teamwork in action. And I can tell you at the governor's, like what the governor does when it's time for a big decision is, which is, a regular occurrence. We begin the conversation with the person who has been at the table the least amount of time, to make sure that they get as much time as they're willing to take to describe what they think we should do and why. And then we go to the next person who's been there the least amount of time, and so on. And the governor always goes last, never leads with, here's what I think. Here's what I think we should do. What do you think? That would be completely backwards. Okay. And that means that we don't just practice collegiality or, sussing each other out or debating one another. We actually make it an obligation. It is part of the deal. And if you do that, then most of the time, by the time you get to the governor doesn't have to decide anything. Everybody's reached clarity. You've asked enough questions, and you're kind of like, what? I agree with this. And so let's make it so. And anyway, so my advice is to not try to do everything yourself. In fact, I don't think it's possible. I mean, you could work every minute that you're awake if you want, and you just be doing stuff that somebody else is already doing for you. And people who are actually better at it. People are, you've got a lot of great experts in the central bank, and you can learn more from them in half an hour on a one-on-one than you could learn by reading for a whole week on a subject. Nobody, it's just an inefficient way to spend your time. So anyway, my advice is not just to do teamwork, but to take it literally. That is, make your team work, right? And then just mop it up. One of the books I read when I just became a CEO was, the title of it, and I forget who wrote it now. The title is Do Nothing. The first thing is how to be a great CEO, the little print. And then the big title is Do Nothing. Okay. And, so if everybody thinks the boss is doing nothing, they'll do all the stuff and say, here's what we think we should do. And it's hard to practice because it feels risky. It feels like somebody's going to make a mistake, and you're going to wear it. There's always a risk with it, but there's no reward without some risk. And taking that risk delivers every time in my experience.
I agree. People often underestimate what they can delegate. We're not a huge organization at Venture for Canada. We're around 35 people, but someone who reports into me was asking for support around delegation and provided this list of tasks and around 15 things. And I went through them, like probably half of them, and I was just like, delegate, 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 delegate. And I share that just because I think that it is something, not just this person, but like most people, including myself at many points, will underestimate how much they can delegate to their teams in order to get more stuff done. Anyway, Steve, this has been such a pleasure. We have chatted about such a wide range of topics, everything from Star Trek to your personal journey around understanding and embracing uncertainty and some of the macroeconomic factors that are driving this new age of uncertainty. I think your book is an excellent read for anybody who wants to understand some of the factors shaping the world, and the main takeaway that one can't predict the future, except to say that it's going to be more uncertain than the past. So, Steve, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a true pleasure today.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture for Canada, or email us at podcast@ventureforcanada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sturrett. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful.